He provided a calendar for the Jews in Palestine 60 years previously, with every solstice, every equinox, and every year having every new moon and holy days. So they sort of also understood they're basically Messianic Jews, so they did accept Christ's sacrifice, but also understood their own calendar. So then when I started studying it in a bit more detail, what I was finding was there was indicators that were clear enough in Scripture from Deuteronomy 16 and a few other places, but for some reason God hadn't listed it out in sort of a page and a half of Scripture very clearly, so that the holy days that were put aside not just for Israel but for all of humanity couldn't be misunderstood. And at the time, my conclusion was that it was sort of left like looking through a glass darkly, or a bit of a cloudy issue, to prevent idolaters, and like the Trinitarians, or like perhaps even some of the churches of God, certainly a lot of rabbinical Judaism, for the most part weren't allowed to meet with God during His holy time. And the effect of it was that they, at the time of Christ, or just after, in the first century, rabbinical Judaism began accommodating and enforcing by law a crescent moon to start the month instead of the month conjunction, which had been the historical beginning of the month. At the same time, they were trying to make Pentecost fall on Sivan 6 instead of the Sunday, 50 days from the wave sheep offering within unleavened bread. Well, historically, those are the only two issues being contested over what's termed the Jewish calendar, but we're talking about the calendar used at the time of Jesus Christ. So, historically, there was never a debate over the start of the year. The trouble is, because outside of Deuteronomy 16 stating that at the start of the year you're talking about having barley in either a very early or getting to a later stage of growth, but it has to be present, or should be present, which in most years it is. It can be delayed by long winters in the Middle East, and it can come to a head much earlier in a very wet and then warm and dry spring, which will have the barley grow weeks faster than in certain other years. So now you have an annual discrepancy, like the barley just doesn't grow according to a standard format. Plus, you see today, a lot of the primitive grains that grew in a barren land 2,000 years ago, a lot of them have been lost. So we're using, in a lot of cases, sometimes modern grains, and the Karaites and others actually then plant the barley to coincide with the start of the year that they envision wanting. And of course, then in the matter of a sabbatical year, there wouldn't be any barley planted to harvest. So you could only go out and look at wild barley that was growing in small places, and usually would be eaten by the goats and the livestock out there, so there wouldn't be much to judge by. So barley is an indicator and not a dictator of the start of the year, but it does all pretty much fall in what's termed the sign of Aries, which is a astrological, is an astronomical sign as well. It almost always falls within the period of March 19th or 20th to April 20th or so, at which time barley is growing in most of the Middle East, although at different levels. So the fact that the Karaites publish 2 calendars every winter for the start of their year, and then they then let everybody know by email or phone call, depending on the state of the growth of the barley, as to when the actual year starts, which of course all of humanity has to keep these laws, so they have to keep it in their local communities all over the world, and therefore the dates and the times have to be published ahead of time, or what was happening with the Jews in the dispersion kept 2 days, because they knew the published times of when the conjunction was and estimated a day or two later when they would see the first crescent. And you have numerous churches that do that today. But all this was part of the studies I was doing years ago when I understood that amongst with Worldwide and a lot of other New Covenant churches, they were wrong perhaps 50 or 60% of the time. And even I felt at the time that even though it was in my heart and everybody else's heart to do it in the right, and they thought they were doing it right, and if it was incorrect, it was the Jews or somebody else's problem or fault. And I was inclined to believe that, you see, a New Covenant church should be spending its time teaching every one of its members how to make a judgment on their own. I didn't mean do mathematics or anything like that, so that we could understand the plan and the mind of God to evaluate what it is He expects of us. Now, if He puts in Scripture on Deuteronomy 16 that at the time of the start of the year is Aviv, which coincides almost precisely with what we're calling Aviv, or Abib, with the sign of Aries, you can expect that it will be falling sometime close to what we're calling the vernal or spring equinox. Very close. But it is spelled out as a clear enough indicator, although in Scripture, or I haven't found it anywhere, and no one has shown it to me, and asking for it with a lot of different groups and people, was why the start of the year then would be based on the full moon falling after the equinox. The equinox is a long-known date and a standard, and the fact is we're coming out of the Dark Ages caused by Trinitarians, so we know a lot less of the time cycles. They didn't have any TV sets. They go every night. They knew exactly when the constellations rose and fell. They knew when the moon came and went, especially if they lived near the sea. So the time sequences weren't as big a mystery to those people. We're supposedly more educated than they were, but in fact we're not. And they built huge structures on exact, precise alignment for the spring and fall equinoxes, for the winter and summer solstices, falling on December 21st and June 21st. Another interesting wording that is in Scripture is that the summer solstice or the Tekufa falls at the time when kings go out for war, which in the Middle East is always June, July, August. So there are a few scriptures that give an indication of the times and the changes in the year, but it's not plainly enough worded, so I thought that we basically had to use also what was done historically. Now, historically, the years were published ahead, and when Christ was alive, even though He condemned a lot of what the Pharisees and Sadducees were doing, He never said a word about the calendar. Now, in the Mishnah, in the first century, so it's very close to the time of Christ, in the Megillah was a statement that you had to read the book of Esther on the 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th of the last month of the year. If it turned out that the year was intercalated or added a month to have a second Adar, then you had to read it again. And it was stated as a requirement, but the point of that is that there was an intercalation or an adding of a month a year, which wouldn't be necessary if you use the new moon following the equinox or the time frame. You wouldn't be needing to add months because it would coincide more readily. And that's true, except about half the time it falls outside of Aries, which is a history, but it's still, it was used at the time of Christ. Josephus and Philo are writing at the time of Christ. It's not like this is recent corrupted history. And Josephus' statements on the temple have all been, even though they were contested at the time by many groups, especially the Jews, that he's been shown to be correct. That the Western Wailing Wall is the fort of Antonia. It's not the wall. Which confirms what Christ says, that not a stone will be left standing. because otherwise Jesus